Her husband threw her and their 3 children into the cold night, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Stay with us to see how a barefoot, broken mother turned a forgotten patch of dirt into a new life, not just for her family, but for an entire community of women. The sound of a bottle smashing against the wall made Guadalupe shudder. The children, huddled in a corner of the living room, were barely breathing. Her husband Esteban was standing in the middle of the room, his face red from alcohol, and his eyes bloodshot with rage. His button-down shirt revealed a belly swollen from drinking, and his breath was a disgusting mixture of tequila and sweat. "You're useless, Guadalupe! A burden!" he shouted, spitting out the words as if they burned his mouth. Guadalupe pressed her hands against her abdomen, trying to stop the trembling. They had been like this for years, but it was getting worse every night. Esteban came home drunker, crueler, and more despicable. She had learned to gauge the danger by the way he opened the door, the way he dropped his keys on the table, the first insult that came out of his mouth. "Tomorrow I'll look for more work," Guadalupe said. "Just give me time," she whispered, her voice broken. He laughed, a dry, venomous laugh. "Work for what? If all you earn you spend on brats who are good for nothing." The little ones cowered even further into the corner, their little eyes filled with terror. The youngest, Rosario, barely 3 years old, sobbed silently with her little hands over her mouth, as if she knew that any noise could enrage her father even more. Guadalupe approached cautiously. "Please, Esteban, don't wake the children." But he didn't listen. His hand rose suddenly and the blow was sharp and brutal. Her cheek burned instantly and her whole body reeled backward. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. "I told you to shut up!" The children cried when they saw her fall, but none of them moved. They knew that if they did, their father's fury could turn against them. Guadalupe, dizzy from the blow, held onto the edge of a chair so she wouldn't fall to the floor. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "I've had enough," Esteban muttered, staggering towards the door. "I don't want you here. I never want to see you again." Guadalupe raised her head, confused. "What, are you leaving?" he growled, slamming the door open. "You and your damn brats!" The cold early morning air rushed in like a slap in the face. Guadalupe felt panic tighten her chest. "You can't do this! This is my house!" she yelled, kicking the table and sending the plates crashing to the floor, shattering into pieces. "I'm in charge here." The children clung to their mother's legs, sobbing. Guadalupe looked around. She had no money, nowhere to go, no one. "Esteban, please," she said, but he wasn't listening. He grabbed her arm so hard that she felt like he was tearing her skin off. He dragged her to the door and pushed her violently, causing her to fall to her knees in the dust of the courtyard. The children ran after her with fear painted on their little faces. Guadalupe hugged them tightly, trying to protect them from the cold and the humiliation. Behind her, the door slammed shut. The silence that followed was worse than the screams. She remained there, kneeling on the ground, tears streaming down her swollen face. Her children clung to her, trembling. Her clothes were dirty, her feet bare, and her dignity in tatters. The sky was dark, with no moon and no stars, as if the whole night had swallowed them up. She had nothing, no home, no hope, but she had to move on. She couldn't stay there. She got up with difficulty and took her children's hands. She didn't know where they would go, but she did know one thing: she would never return. With bare feet and a broken soul, she began to walk without looking back, the cold chilling her to the bone. Guadalupe held Rosario, who was trembling silently with purple lips, to her chest. Emilio and Tomas walked beside her in the darkness, dragging their bare feet across the dry earth. They had not eaten anything all day. The night wind blew like a lament, stirring up dust and dead leaves on that road that led nowhere. Guadalupe's blouse was torn on one side. Her skirt was soaked with tears and dirt. Her body ached from the fall, the blow, the humiliation, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let her children feel her despair. Every step felt like agony. The weight of Rosario in her arms weakened her, but she would never let her go. Emilio, the oldest, barely 7 years old, stumbled and fell to his knees on the ground. Guadalupe bent down quickly to pick him up, but she didn't have the strength. He looked at her with eyes full of tears, but said nothing. He knew they couldn't complain. They couldn't afford that luxury. "Mommy, my tummy hurts," Tomas whispered in a muffled voice. Guadalupe closed her eyes for a moment. Her stomach was also growling, but that didn't matter. She had to find food. She had to find shelter. In the distance, through the early morning mist, she saw the silhouettes of a few small houses scattered on the plain, a village. She didn't know its name, or if anyone would help her, but it was her only option. She kept going, feeling the icy air burn her skin. When she reached the first streets, the village was silent. Only a few lights flickered behind the windows. She could smell smoke, wood burning in fireplaces, a warmth from which she and her children were completely excluded. She knocked on the door of the first house. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third. Footsteps were heard on the other side, and a crack opened. Cautiously, "Who's there?" Guadalupe swallowed hard. Her voice was broken when she spoke. "Please, my children and I need help." A silence. Then the door closed without further ado. Guadalupe felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. She couldn't allow herself that either. She kept walking, clutching her children's cold little hands. The glances of the few people walking through the streets pierced her like knives. Some whispered, others ignored her completely. She stopped in a small square. There was a broken wooden bench in one corner. "We'll stay here for now," she whispered, trying to sound calm. Rosario was so exhausted that she didn't even protest when Guadalupe settled her on her lap. Emilio and Tomas hugged their mother for warmth. Hunger was tormenting them. Guadalupe's mouth was dry and her stomach shriveled, but it didn't matter. The children had to sleep, even if it was on the ground. Dawn came too slowly. When the sunlight began to illuminate the streets, Guadalupe noticed some women passing by with baskets of bread and freshly made tortillas. The aroma was a cruel blow. She got up with difficulty. "Wait here," she said to her children. She approached one of the women who was arranging her goods in a small stall. "Excuse me, is there any food you could give me for my children? We have nothing." The woman with a serious face and weathered hands looked her up and down, then grimaced in disgust. "Nobody gives anything away here, ma'am. If you want food, work." Guadalupe felt her chest tighten. "I'll do anything." The woman looked at her for a moment longer, then picked up an old broom. "Clean the yard, and I'll give you some bread." Guadalupe didn't think twice. She took the broom and began to sweep the dry earth desperately. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop until the ground was clean. The woman threw her a loaf of stale bread. "That's all I can give you." Guadalupe caught it and nodded gratefully. She said nothing more. She ran to her children and broke the bread into 3 pieces, giving it to them without taking a single bite for herself. The children ate in silence, their mouths full of dust and dry tears on their cheeks. Guadalupe hugged them. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to get by. She had to, not for herself, but for them. The wind blew dust across the dry earth as Guadalupe beat the ground with her bare hands. Her nails were broken, her fingers covered with open wounds from the hardness of the ground. She breathed heavily, sweat sticking her blouse to her body. The sun beat down on her hunched back, but she did not stop. She had arrived at that hamlet days ago, after wandering aimlessly with her children. The place was little more than an empty shell of what was once a home. Cracked adobe walls, a half-collapsed roof, and a dirt floor where one could barely lie down without feeling the cold of dawn creeping through her bone. But it was all she had. The children slept on a worn cloth sack in a corner, exhausted after days without shelter. Guadalupe watched them for a moment, their dirty faces, their bodies thin from hunger, their legs covered in scrapes from walking barefoot for so long. She bit her lip hard. She couldn't let them continue like this. She had to find a way to feed them, which is why she had. She had heard some women in the village talk about the fertile soil after the rains. She had no tools, but her hands would suffice. She struck the dry earth once more, feeling the latent pain in her joints. She was about to give up when her fingers touched something hard, buried beneath the surface. She stopped and scratched harder, desperately removing the dry clods. And then she saw it, a dark wooden edge protruding from the... She held her breath and frantically pulled the object out of the ground. It was an old box closed with a rusty lock. Her heart was pounding as she tried to open it with her numb fingers. Finally, The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in yellowed, dusty paper, were small cloth bags tied with thick string. Guadalupe took them with trembling hands and opened them. It took her mind a while to process it. It was a box full of seeds: corn, beans, squash, chilies. There were also folded papers written in faded ink. She carefully unfolded them. They were notes about cultivation, about how to prepare the soil, about when to plant each thing. She felt a lump in her throat. It was a sign. It had to be. Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. After days of hunger, cold, and despair, hope manifested itself in the simplest and most powerful way: the possibility of growing something. She pressed the papers against her chest, feeling her own body tremble. She had a path, and this time she would not fail. Before we go on, imagine Guadalupe in that moment, clutching that box of seeds in her shaking hands. If you were by her side, what would you tell her? Write your message to her in the comments. Your words might give courage to someone listening today. The soil was hard, unyielding, as if the earth itself refused to give her a chance. Guadalupe dug her fingers into the dry dust and closed them tightly, feeling frustration burn in her chest. In front of her, the seeds she had found waited to be planted, like a fragile promise of a future she could not yet touch. But she did not know how to do it. She had never worked in the fields. She had never planted anything. The sun beat down hard, and her sweat-soaked blouse clung to her back. At her side, Emilio and Tomas watched her in silence, their lips parched and their stomachs empty. Rosario slept under a piece of cloth that Guadalupe had hung between two old pieces of wood to provide a little shade. Days had passed since she found the box with the seeds, and each of those days had been a struggle against hunger. She had not managed to get any food other than a few scraps that the townspeople threw at her with contempt. No one wanted to help her. They looked at her with suspicion, as if she were a nuisance, as if her misery were her fault. Water was scarce. She had managed to fill a small container at the fountain in the square, but it wasn't enough. She divided it between the need to hydrate her children and the hope of growing something in that dry soil. "Mommy, I'm hungry," whispered Tomas in a muffled voice. Guadalupe felt something break inside her. "I know, my love. We'll have food soon, very soon." But her voice trembled. She dug with her bare hands, letting the earth scratch her skin. She made small holes, put the seeds inside, and covered them with hot dust. Then she took the container of water and poured a few drops on each mound of earth. "Please grow," she whispered. Days passed, and nothing sprouted. Hunger worsened. The children stopped playing. They stopped talking. Emilio could barely stand. Rosario cried constantly at night, her cries a faint lament that pierced Guadalupe's soul like 1,000 needles. Then the fever came. He lay under the old base they used as a bed. Guadalupe touched his forehead and felt the heat burning on his skin. "My God," she whispered desperately. She took him in her arms, pressing him against her chest, feeling fear take hold of her. She had to do something. She had to get help. She ran out with the child in her arms, barefoot, feeling every stone dig into her feet. She ran through the village, knocking on doors, begging with a broken voice, "Please, my son is sick." But no one wanted to get involved until a deep voice stopped her. "Ma'am," Guadalupe turned with her heart in her throat. An older man with a face weathered by the sun and hands thick from work looked at her seriously. "Come with me." It was Don Ramiro, the village shoemaker. She didn't know why he was helping her. She didn't understand what he saw in her, but at that moment, she didn't care. He gave her some hot broth, lent her a blanket for the child, and gave her instructions on how to bring down the fever. "He won't last long without food," he said with a sigh. "And if you keep trying to plant like this, you'll only waste more time." Guadalupe felt a lump in her throat. "I don't know how to do it." Don Ramiro looked at her silently for a moment, then nodded to himself. "I'll help you." Those words were the closest thing to hope she had felt in a long time. Before continuing, we want to know more about you. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment with the name of your city or country. We'd love to know how far our stories are reaching. Guadalupe sat on the floor with her arms wrapped around her legs and her head buried between her knees. Tomas slept beside her, his little body still trembling from the fever, but calmer after Don Ramiro's help. Rosario and Emilio were also asleep, their dirty, thin faces reflecting the wear and tear of so many days of hunger. The wind entered through the cracks in the adobe walls, whistling like a lament. Guadalupe closed her eyes tightly, feeling despair envelop her like a heavy blanket. She had done everything she could. She had begged. She had worked until her hands bled. And even then, the earth gave her nothing. A shadow approached, and she barely looked up. "Ma'am," it was Don Ramiro. He carried a sack on his shoulder and held a shovel in his other hand. "Get up," he said in a firm, calm voice. Guadalupe did not move. "I can't." "Of course you can," he replied. "And you will." She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "I don't know how to plant. I don't know how to do anything." The old man put the sack on the ground and looked at her seriously. "I'll teach you." Guadalupe felt the air catch in her throat. He wasn't offering her pity. He wasn't giving her an empty promise. He was giving her an opportunity. She stood up with difficulty and followed him outside. The sun was already high when Don Ramiro began to explain how to prepare the soil. Guadalupe watched him carefully as he took the shovel and turned the dry surface with movements. "You can't plant in dead soil," he said. "You have to give it life." First, he showed her how to make furrows, how to mix the soil with fertilizer, and how to make sure each seed had enough space to grow. "You won't see results in a day," he warned. "But if you do it right, the earth will respond." Guadalupe felt a twinge in her chest. It was the first time someone had trusted her. The following days were hard. From dawn to dusk, they dug, turned, and prepared the soil. Don Ramiro brought old tools he had borrowed from the village, and little by little, the land began to transform. And then something unexpected happened. One day, while Guadalupe was carrying a bucket of water from the fountain, a young woman approached her. "Are you planting in the old house today?" she said cautiously. Guadalupe looked at her suspiciously. The young woman's face was marked by small scars, and her dark eyes were filled with a sadness that Guadalupe recognized instantly. "Yes," she replied. The girl lowered her gaze and fidgeted with her fingers. "Can I help?" Guadalupe felt a lump in her throat. Why would she want to help me? The young woman took a moment to respond. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing." Her name was Carmen, and she had heard about a violent husband who had almost beaten her to death. She had arrived in the village a few months ago and survived by doing odd jobs, keeping away from people. But when she saw Guadalupe, when she saw her children, she felt she couldn't stand idly by. They worked together day after day under the hot sun and cold nights. Guadalupe had never had anyone by her side who asked for nothing in return, and little by little, with each seed buried, with each furrow dug, the emptiness in her chest was filled with something new. And then the neighbors began to notice. First, it was an old woman who left some corn at the door of the shack, without saying a word. Then a man from the village brought some old boards and nails to repair the roof. One day, without warning, a group of women arrived with blankets and clothes for the children. Guadalupe didn't know what to say. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her trembling voice. One of the women, with a stern but kind face, looked at her with a slight shrug. "Because we saw how you fought for your children, without asking for anything. That's worth more than 100 words." Guadalupe felt tears burning her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she lowered her head and pressed her lips together, feeling for the first time in a long time that she was not alone. She had found something more than seeds buried in the earth. She had found hope. The earth was moist. Guadalupe cautiously sank her fingers into the soil, feeling the soft, warm texture between her hands. It was different. It was no longer the dry, arid surface of before. Something had changed. Something was alive. The sun had not yet fully risen, but the sky was already showing flashes of orange light on the horizon. The early morning dew covered the leaves of the plants with small crystalline drops, and the air had a different scent, fresh and full of promise. Guadalupe bent down, her heart racing, and gently pushed the soil aside, and there it was, a small green stem, fragile but firm, peeking timidly out of the ground. She felt a lump in her throat. She stood still, watching it as if it were a miracle, as if she couldn't believe that after so much effort, After so many days of broken hands, sleepless nights, and tears shed, something was finally growing. "Mom!" Emilio's voice brought her out of her trance. She turned her head and saw her son running toward her, barefoot and with his hair tousled. Behind him, Rosario and Tomas followed, staggering with sleep. "Mom, there's more!" Guadalupe felt her chest fill with an emotion that almost hurt. She stood up and walked quickly toward the rest of the land. And there they were, small leaves sprouting in different places, scattered among the furrows she had worked so hard to make. Guadalupe fell to her knees and ran her hands over each sprout with almost reverential care. "They're growing," she whispered. Rosario hugged her mother while Emilio and Tomas bent down to touch the leaves with the curiosity of someone who had never seen anything like it before. "Now we're going to have food," Tomas asked in a low voice. Guadalupe closed her eyes and hugged him to her chest. "Yes, my love, now we will." The following weeks were filled with tireless work. Guadalupe, with the help of Carmen and Don Ramiro, made sure to water the land at the right times, protect the plants from the scorching sun, and remove the weeds that threatened to choke the sprouts. The first time she pulled a corn plant out of the ground with her own hands, she felt her legs tremble. She held it carefully as if it were a treasure, and then pressed it against her chest, allowing herself to cry for all she had suffered to get there. The first day she cooked with her own harvest was an event. Carmen helped prepare corn served with salt, and the children ate with a joy that Guadalupe had never seen on their faces. "It's been a long time since it's been this delicious," said Rosario with her mouth full. Guadalupe laughed, feeling the weight of the world lightening on her shoulders. But what she didn't expect was what happened next. The vegetables grew faster than she imagined, and soon she found herself with more food than her family could consume. Carmen was the one who suggested the idea. "We could take some to town to sell or exchange for other things we need." The idea scared her at first. For months, the community had looked at her with suspicion, as if she were an intruder. But when she took the first produce to the market, the reaction surprised her. "Is this corn yours?" a woman asked incredulously. Guadalupe nodded. "It grew on my land." The woman took an ear of corn and looked at it closely, then nodded and took out some coins. "Give me 4. That day, she sold everything. When she returned to the hut with a sack of beans and some tortillas she had bought with the proceeds, the children jumped for joy. Days passed, and the news spread. The townspeople began to see Guadalupe in a different light. The same people who had previously refused to help her now approached her with curiosity, asking about her products and exchanging food and utensils for her vegetables. One day, an elderly woman approached her with a kind smile and handed her a basket of freshly baked bread for her children. "Here," she said simply. Guadalupe felt something inside her settle into place. She was no longer the broken woman who had arrived barefoot and with her soul in pieces. Now she had something. She had land. She had food. She had a community. For the first time in a long time, she had a home. If seeing Guadalupe finally find a home gives you a little hope too, tap the like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear that their situation can change. Guadalupe had never thought about anything beyond the next day. For months, her life had been reduced to surviving, to making sure her children had something in their stomachs before going to sleep, to keeping the small vegetable garden alive under the scorching sun and the unpredictable rains. There was no room in her mind for dreams, much less for imagining that her story would go beyond that small town where she had learned to be reborn. But fate, which had struck her so many times, had other plans for her this time. It was just another morning when the sound of an unfamiliar engine echoed in the town square. Guadalupe was arranging pumpkins in her basket when she saw the vehicle stop in front of the market. It was a white van with a logo painted on the sides, the emblem of a local radio station. A man with a camera and a woman with an inquisitive look got out of the vehicle, asked one of the vendors something, and after a few moments turned toward Guadalupe. She felt her stomach shrink. She was not used to attracting attention. She had always been the invisible woman, the one no one looked at, the one who had to go unnoticed to avoid problems. But now, these two people were watching her with interest. "Are you Guadalupe, the vegetable seller?" asked the woman in a firm but not hostile voice. Guadalupe felt her throat go dry. She glanced sideways at Carmen, who was standing next to her selling chilies, and her friend gave her a slight nod, as if telling her to answer. "Yes, it's me." The man with the camera turned on the device, and the woman smiled, taking another step closer. Closer. "We're from the news station in the capital. We've heard your story about how you came to this town with nothing and created this," she said, pointing to the basket full of fresh produce. "We'd like to interview you." Guadalupe felt the air leave her. "An interview?" "Yes, we believe your story could inspire many people." Inspire was a strange word for her. She didn't feel like someone worthy of admiration. She had only done what she had to do, so her children wouldn't starve. But when she looked around, she saw that some of the vendors were watching her with pride. One of them stood in the distance with her arms crossed and a small smile on her face. And then Guadalupe understood. She had not only changed her own life, she had also changed the way the town saw her. The interview was brief, but intense. They asked her how she got there, how she started the vegetable garden, what motivated her to keep going. "My children," she replied without hesitation. "Everything I do is for them." When the camera turned off, the reporter smiled warmly at her. "Many people will see this, Guadalupe. Perhaps your story will open doors you can't even imagine." And so it was. A week after the report aired, more people began to arrive in the village asking for her products. A man from a neighboring village offered to buy large quantities of corn and beans. Another woman asked if she could teach her how to plant. For the first time in her life, Guadalupe saw possibilities. Beyond mere survival, it was no longer just about not starving to death. Now, she could begin to live. The afternoon wind kicked up dust on the dirt road. Guadalupe, her hair tied back and her hands covered in dirt, wiped the sweat from her forehead as she checked on the pumpkins that would soon be ready to harvest. In the distance, children played near the cabin. Their laughter mingled with the sound of leaves swaying in the air. It was a quiet day, one of those rare moments when Guadalupe allowed herself to breathe without fear, without feeling the weight of the world crushing her. And then she saw him. The silhouette of a staggering man stood out against the setting sun, advancing along the dusty road that led to her house. Her heart stopped. It was him, Esteban. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. No, not dreaming. Reliving a nightmare. Time seemed to freeze. The sounds around her faded away. Her whole body tensed, an involuntary reflex from years of terror ingrained in her bones. Her hands trembled, and she felt the urge to run, to hide, to disappear. But she was no longer the same woman she had been before. She forced herself to stand firm as she watched him approach. He looked different, his face gaunt, his clothes dirty and wrinkled, his gait clumsy and tired. But his eyes were still the same, cold, dark, empty. When he was close enough, he raised his hand in a casual gesture, as if nothing had happened, as if time had meant nothing. "Lupe," he said, his voice slurred by alcohol and years of abuse, which made her feel nauseous. Guadalupe didn't respond. He smiled, revealing yellow teeth. "Look, you're different. Even prettier." The blood ran cold in her veins. She stared at him, her jaw clenched, without moving. She couldn't let him back into her life. "What are you doing here, Esteban?" Her voice was low and controlled. He sighed, putting his hands in his pockets as if he were comfortable, as if he still had the right to be there. "I heard you're doing well, that you have a vegetable garden, and that you even appeared on TV." "TV?" Guadalupe felt her heart beating hard in her chest. "That's none of your business," he laughed. "Of course it is, Lupe. I'm your husband." Those words made all the air escape from her lungs. "You kicked me out of our house, Esteban. You left us on the street." He shook his head, feigning guilt. "Look, my love, I know I made mistakes, but I've learned my lesson. Life hasn't treated me well without you, and that's it. Enough is enough. I'm ready to come back." The coldness with which he said it hit her like a knife. Come back, as if she had been waiting for him, as if all the pain she suffered, the humiliation, the hunger, the cold nights with her children crying, had meant nothing, as if he still had power over her. Guadalupe felt fear tangling in her stomach. Even though she knew she wasn't the same, even though she had built a new life, her body still remembered what it was like to fear him. Esteban took a step forward, and she backed away without realizing it. He smiled. "You're still just as fearful, Lupe, but you don't have to be afraid of me. Now I'm going to treat you well. Come on, let me in." Emilio's voice brought her out of her trance. "Mom, who is he?" The boy was a few meters away, with Rosario holding his hand, and Tomas behind him, his little eyes looking at Esteban with suspicion. Guadalupe's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. This man who now feigned remorse was the same man who had let them starve, who had mercilessly thrown them out in the middle of the night, condemning them to misery. She looked at her children, then at Esteban. Something inside her clicked. No more. She took a breath and lifted her chin. "You have no business here, Esteban." His face hardened. "Don't be stubborn, Lupe. You know you need me." Guadalupe felt rage wash over her, a rage that had been buried inside her for years. "Need you?" She spat out the words. "I raised my children on my own. I survived on my own when you threw us out. I learned to live without fear on my own." Esteban frowned and his jaw tightened. "Lower your tone, Guadalupe. You're still my wife, and I'm not yours." The silence was brutal. Esteban narrowed his eyes and his face darkened. "You're wrong, Lupe." She didn't respond. She stood her ground. He looked at her for a few more seconds. His jaw clenched, his fists closed. Then he spat on the ground and snorted. "You'll regret this." He turned around and began to stagger away. Guadalupe felt her legs give way, but she didn't let fear dominate her. She watched him walk away and waited. She waited for his shadow to disappear down the road. She waited for the past to release her completely. And when it finally did, she felt that for the first time in her life, she was truly free. Night fell over the village with a dense, heavy silence, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath. Guadalupe had not been able to relax since Esteban left. Although her body was exhausted from the day's work, her mind could not find rest. Every noise outside made her shudder. Every shadow cast on the wall made her hold her breath. Her heart still remembered what it was like to live in fear. And although she knew she was no longer the same woman who once trembled before him, her body reacted as if she still were. The children slept together on the old mattress, hugging each other in an attempt to find warmth. Guadalupe looked at them and felt something inside her break. She couldn't allow that man to cross the threshold again. She couldn't let his dark shadow cloud her home again. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Her heart stopped for a second, and then began to beat with uncontrolled, brutal force. She approached cautiously, feeling that each step weighed a ton. "Who is it?" she asked. Even deep down, she already knew. A tense silence, then a deep voice dripping with venom and alcohol. "Open the door, Guadalupe." Fear hit her in the chest with the force of a wave. She didn't answer. Another knock, louder this time. "I know you're there. Don't make this harder." The children stirred on the mattress. Emilio opened his eyes, sleepy but alert. "Mom, is that him?" Guadalupe felt her blood boil. "It's okay, my darling. Go back to sleep." But her own voice was trembling. Another knock. "Don't make me angry, Guadalupe." That tone, that veiled threat, she knew it so well. It was the same voice she heard before every blow, before every insult, before every night of terror. But this time she wasn't alone. She took a deep breath and clenched her fists. And instead of opening the door, she walked to the window and screamed with all the strength she had in her soul. "Help! The scream broke the silence of the night like a bolt of lightning. For a moment, there was absolute silence. And then the sound of doors opening, of hurried footsteps, of murmuring voices. Esteban took a step back. "What the hell are you doing?" Guadalupe felt fear in every fiber of her body, but she didn't let it paralyze her. "You have no business here. Get out!" Lights began to come on in the nearby houses. And then, like a miracle, the silhouettes of the neighbors emerged in the darkness. Don Ramiro was the first to arrive with his old machete hanging from his belt, then Carmen with a frown and a lamp in her hand. After that, more and more people approached, forming a small circle around the house. Esteban looked around, bewildered. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Guadalupe to not be alone. "This is nobody else's business." Don Ramiro spat on the ground and crossed his arms. "It seems that it is." Carmen stepped forward, her eyes burning with rage. "She is no longer alone, you damn coward! You have to leave," said another man, one of the merchants who bought his vegetables here. "We don't want you here." The voices began to join in, some angry, others warning, but all united in the same message. There is no place for you here. Esteban looked around, feeling the taste of defeat for the first time. Guadalupe looked him in the eyes, and for the first time she saw no power in them, no control, no fear. She saw a pathetic man, alone and empty, and she understood something. She owed him nothing. She owed him no fear. He clenched his jaw, spat on the ground, and took a step back. "You'll rot without me," Esteban growled, but his voice no longer had the edge it had before. She didn't respond. She just watched him turn and disappear into the night. When his shadow disappeared completely, she felt she could breathe again. The neighbors looked at her with pride. Carmen squeezed her hand tightly. Don Ramiro patted her on the shoulder. "It's over now," he said. Guadalupe closed her eyes and let out a trembling sigh. Yes, it was over. For the first time in her life, fear had lost. Time passed. Life in the village continued as if Esteban's shadow had never crossed the threshold of her home again. But Guadalupe knew that something inside her had changed forever. For the first time in years, she didn't sleep with fear suffocating her, cowering when she heard a noise in the night. She wasn't afraid to open the door or look into the eyes of the people around her. She was no longer the woman who had left her old life behind, barefoot and with a broken soul. She had built something with her own hands, and he had seen her do it from the beginning. Javier had been there from the first day she arrived in the village, silent, discreet, helping without expecting anything in return. When the roof of her house threatened to collapse, he was the one who brought the beams. When the first rains came, he reinforced the windows so that the water would not get in. When the children needed something, he appeared with wooden toys he had made with his own hands. He was always there, but he never imposed himself, never demanded, never expected more than she was willing to give. That's why it took Guadalupe a while to notice what had always been there. It was a quiet afternoon when she found him in the yard of her house hammering a broken board. She watched him in silence. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing the strong forearms of a man accustomed to work. His dark hair had gray streaks at the temples, and his sun-weathered face had the seriousness of someone who had lived too long. But what always caught her attention were his hands, large hands with thick, firm fingers, hands that knew how to build, that knew how to hold, but that had never known how to hurt. "You don't have to do that," she said with a small smile on her lips. Javier looked up, surprised. "It's broken. If I don't fix it, it's going to fall apart." She crossed her arms and looked at him with a sparkle in her eyes. "And who said it's your job to fix it?" Javier put the hammer aside and wiped his hands on his pants. "It's not my job, but I like doing it." Guadalupe felt a strange warmth in her chest, something that was neither fear nor anguish nor despair, something she hadn't felt in years. Trust. With Javier, there were no games, no threats, no veiled words, no poisoned words, no broken promises. There was only him, his calm presence, his way of being without demanding, the way he looked at her as if he saw something in her that no one else had seen. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and without realizing it, Guadalupe began to wait for him. If stories of strength, healing, and second chances like Guadalupe's inspire you, consider subscribing to the channel. That way you won't miss the next stories of women turning pain into power. She waited for the days when he would show up with any excuse to repair something, to help with the harvest, to bring her nails when she didn't really needed them. One day, Rosario tripped and hurt her knee. Javier picked her up with the ease of someone accustomed to carrying the weight of the world, and cleaned her up so carefully that Guadalupe felt a lump in her throat. That night, when the children were asleep and the village was silent, he stayed longer than usual. He leaned against the wall and looked at her with an intensity that made her shiver. "I don't know if anyone has ever told you that," Guadalupe said softly, "but you are the strongest woman I have ever known." She felt the air catch in her throat. "I'm not," she whispered. "I just do what I have to do." Javier shook his head. "You do much more than that." The silence between them was long and heavy, but not uncomfortable. Guadalupe felt her heart beating fast. Javier did not try to touch her or get closer than necessary. He just looked at her with the patience of someone willing to wait as long as necessary. And for the first time in her life, Guadalupe felt that she didn't have to be afraid of love. The wind blew gently over the green fields, rustling the leaves with an almost musical murmur. The afternoon sun bathed the earth in warm light, making the corn stalks, rows of pumpkins, and small chili bushes that stretched as far as the eye could see. Guadalupe stood in the middle of the fertile land, with her hands on her hips, breathing in the fresh scent of the harvest. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound of laughter and the voices of women and children around her envelop her. There was no longer silence. There was no longer loneliness. Years had passed since that night when she confronted Esteban. Years since she stopped trembling at every shadow, since she learned to lift her face and walk with pride. Now she was here, the leader of something much bigger than she ever imagined. The lands that were once barren were now full of life, but not only that, now they were not only hers. She had achieved something that even in her wildest dreams she could not have imagined. A network of community gardens run by women who, like her, once believed they had no way out. Doña Guadalupe called out to a voice behind of her. She turned and saw a young woman approaching with a basket full of freshly harvested tomatoes. It was Mariana, a woman who had arrived in the village with eyes sunken with despair, with the same fears that Guadalupe had once carried. "Where would you like us to put this?" she asked with a shy smile. Guadalupe smiled back. "Over there, next to the pumpkins." Mariana nodded and walked toward the wooden tables where other women were packing the produce. Some were chatting and laughing. Others were helping their children tie sacks of corn. Each of them had a story. Some had escaped from men who beat them. Others had been abandoned to fend for themselves. Many had arrived with nothing but fear in their eyes and despair in their souls. And now they were standing here, working, building something with their own hands, just as Guadalupe had done. "I never imagined this was possible," said Carmen, appearing at her side with a basket in her arms. Guadalupe looked at her and smiled. Carmen was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived one day asking for help in the vegetable garden. Now she was her right-hand woman, her friend, her sister in this struggle. "Not even me," admitted Guadalupe. "But here we are." Carmen looked at her with a gleam of pride in her eyes. "Thanks to you." Guadalupe shook her head. "No, thanks to all of you, because this was not just her story. It was the story of many, the story of women who refused to be victims, who took the land into their own hands and transformed it into something new." Guadalupe looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky orange and red. For the first time in her life, she felt that she was exactly where she should be, free, strong, alive. The afternoon breeze carried with it the scent of wet earth. Guadalupe paused at the threshold of the new community center and let the wind caress her face. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel it all. The warm sun on her skin, the murmur of the women working in the gardens, the laughter of the children running through the fields. The day had come after so many years of struggle, after so much pain, fear, and despair. She was standing in the place she herself had helped to build, a safe space for women like her, for mothers who once believed they had no way out, for those who arrived with broken hearts, but with hope still burning deep within them. She adjusted the shawl on her shoulders and took a deep breath. In the distance, she saw Carmen arranging the tables with the harvested produce, her young daughter by her side. Don Ramiro, his hair now completely white, supervised the installation of a new wooden structure, scolding the young men who were not nailing the beams with enough force. And there was Javier, her Javier, still with the same serene gaze, with the steady hands of a carpenter, and the infinite patience of a man who had never tried to rush his love for her. It did not come like a whirlwind or a fire that devastates everything in its path. It came like rain after a long drought, like the first sprout of corn that breaks through the earth with force, but calmly approached her with a smile, and took her hand with the same naturalness as always. "Ready," he whispered. Guadalupe looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she knew the answer. Yes. The children ran towards her. They were no longer so small. Emilio was a strong young man. Tomas had the same determined look as his mother. And Rosario, with her long braids and contagious laugh. She squeezed his hand with emotion. Guadalupe looked at her family, her friends, all the women around her, and felt the weight of the past finally fade away. She had made it this far. She had survived. She had won. She took a deep breath and walked toward the front of the community center, while people applauded, and the faces of those women reflected the same strength she once had to find within herself. She took the scissors and cut the red ribbon that officially inaugurated the new space, and with that cut, she closed the last wound of her past. The future belonged to her. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to explore more content on our channel. We have many more emotional and thought-provoking stories like this one that seek to inspire you and show you that there is always hope. Click on the following video and join us for another story that is sure to captivate you from the very beginning. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your comment, and share this video with those you think may need it. Thank you for being part of this community. See you in the next video.